Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Warren me. My name is Gemma Ryan. I think most of you have been here the last few days if you don't know who I am, but I do have some new attendees. I'm the Manager of Strategic Projects at the Faculty of Arts. And if you are just joining us for the lecture, thank you and welcome. I'm just going to get a few things kicked off to start the talk for tonight. The first thing, of course, is to do an acknowledgement of country. On behalf of the Environmental Law Research Centre and myself, we would acknowledge the traditional custodians of Macquarie University land, the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dreaming of time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders both past, present, and emerging. And we would like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And I know we have many other people of other Indigenous cultures, and we'd like to extend that to you as well. A few things are happening tonight. Again, for the people who are new, the bathrooms for this evening, for the building rather, they're always here, not just this evening, are in the southwest corner of the building, so just that way. And the emergency exit down there. We'll coordinate this in case we need to use them. Tonight we have a lecture being delivered by Professor Sara Seck, who we've invited here all the way from Canada. I'm very grateful to have her here. The evening will be moderated by Professor Sara, who is the Director of the Environmental Law Research Centre. The Q&A will be conducted both in person and online. We do have quite a few people who've registered to attend online tonight, so for those attending online, please use the QR code or it's a little cut off at the bottom, but it's slido.com, and the code is 2119174. We'll put that in the chat as well for those of you online. Or please, do use the QR code. Now, it will come back up again later when the Q&A is running. But for now, I will hand over to my colleague, Professor Sara. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Professor Sara Seck, who will deliver the Centre's 2026 annual lecture. We're really very pleased that you have been able to accept the invitations, Professor Seck, and be here with us throughout the conference as well as stay. It has been 2 long days, but I hope enriching days and engaging days. Professor Seck is a full professor at the School of Law of Dalhousie University in Canada. She held the Yogis and Caddy Chair in Human Rights Law from 2021 to 2025. And since July 2023, she is also has served as the director of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at her university. Her research and teaching interests are situated at the intersection of international environmental and human rights law, with attention to business responsibility, sustainable development, climate justice, and the protection of the marine environment. Her work is informed and inspired by feminist, relational, and intersectional approaches to legal analysis, including twine. And you will see that that is also reflected in the talk that Seck is giving today. So without further ado, because if I start talking about her work and publications, it will take 5-10 more minutes. I would like to invite Professor Seck, and she will talk about, the title of her talk is Towards an Intersectional, Relational, Feminist Understanding of the Human for Planetary Justice. Professor Seck, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sara, for the kind introduction, but also more generally for the invitation to come here to give this lecture this evening, and also to have had the opportunity to attend the 2 days of the Planetary Justice workshop, and also to do some work with the Business and Human Rights Access to Justice on Monday. So I've had a wonderful week here, and look forward to sharing some thoughts with you, and then also our discussions following my talk. I'm going to start. I appreciate the land acknowledgement that began the session this evening, and I want to share a little bit of a land acknowledgement myself with regard to where Dalhousie University is located. And so we currently have two different kinds of land acknowledgements. One is a land acknowledgement, another one is an acknowledgement, I think is the way we frame it. The first one focuses on the fact that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kmaq, which is the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And it is governed by peace and friendship treaties. And our Dalhousie land acknowledgement concludes by saying, we are all treaty people, which I think is a very important way of understanding the relationship. It is not just a relationship for Indigenous peoples, it is a relationship that everyone who lives in the land must respect. The second acknowledgement, which has come into being in the last few years, says we recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kmaq known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. So there are many African Nova Scotians, peoples of African descent, who live in Nova Scotia and who have been very much marginalized and discriminated over the course of history, many of them coming to escape slavery from the United States and others coming enslaved within the Nova Scotian context. Apparently, until the 1960s, 50% of the Black people who lived in Canada were living in Nova Scotia. And our university and the law school has had a program known as the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq program in place since the 1980s to enable and support both African Nova Scotians and Indigenous students to grow and thrive. And I think it's a program that we've been very proud of. I joined Dalhousie 10 years ago. And so this is, for me, it was actually quite a new experience to learn about the African Nova Scotian context. But I think this is also important for sort of the context of the talk, right? Relationships with land and environment and human rights are all informed by colonial histories, and they come in many forms, and this includes ideas of racial capitalism, which of course is embodied in the history of slavery. I want to do sort of three things today. First, I want to reflect on some justice frameworks. So the workshop that we've just experienced for the last 2 days had the title of Planetary Justice. And that's a very important framing. The first slide that I have, and you can't quite see the pieces at the bottom, is a list of all kinds of different justice framings that I heard people reference in the time of the conference, and a few of them that I put in there myself before. I think when I came, I had about 6, and then by the time I passed in my slides of the day today, it had grown to this extent. This, I think, again, points to the complexity and intersecting nature of trying to understand and sort out what it means to actually achieve or to aim for planetary justice. So there are, of course, economic and distributive and social justice aspects, recognitional, racial, corrective, restorative, intergenerational, intragenerational, gender, energy justice, environmental justice, procedural justice, climate justice, water justice, and I think behind here is ecological justice and also multi-species justice. Now those are, I think, if people in the room who are here today could say, yes, I've heard people talking about all these different justice dimensions. So one question, I guess, for us to reflect on is, how essential is it to try to meet all of these different justice objectives as part of planetary justice? Is it necessary to trade off, which is what we're sometimes told? Are there ways to sort of harmonize or to understand a planetary justice aim that actually accomplishes and respects all these diverse approaches? I'm going to reflect on a few other frameworks as we move forward. So one of the reasons I think that the planetary justice was chosen was because the UN Environment Program has advocated this idea of triple planetary crisis. So climate, nature, loss, and pollution and waste. should be understood as three intersecting crises. This is important because we've heard a lot about climate justice in the workshop, but sometimes there is this risk of what's sometimes referred to as climate tunnel vision, where the focus on finding climate solutions can inadvertently cause problems for other, whether it's biodiversity justice or the pollution and waste crisis or other kinds of justice dimensions that we saw above. And so I think that's a very important framing, important to keep in mind. And then I also, for people who are familiar with this image, this is a sculpture that was built for the first plastic treaty negotiations by a Canadian Wong Productions. It's known as Turn Off the Plastics Tap. And what I think this also reminds us, I think the plastics crisis is a really good example of the triple planetary crisis problem. Plastics are largely fossil fuel derived, 99% come from virgin fossil fuels, at least as of a few years ago. Therefore, they are part of the climate problem. There are many chemical additives and others, and pollution and waste and microplastics and nanoplastics that point to the pollution and waste aspect, but of course they also cause tremendous harm to biodiversity and also human health. So that's a problem. A different framing, of course, comes from scientists. So this is an image that I suspect many people are familiar with, the sort of latest version of the planetary boundaries science framework. Now, what's interesting, if you've been paying attention to this framework over the years, is how certain pieces get filled in every now and then. So the novel entities piece, if you looked at it the last time, had very little on it. Then people started really paying attention to the plastics problem, to nanoplastics, microplastics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly there was lots of science being done, and then it's like, uh-oh, not only is there lots of science being done, but this is actually a big problem. That's disturbing for a number of reasons, because it suggests that, of course, our knowledge is incomplete. It depends on who's got the funding to do which science, whose knowledge is included in the gathering of science, is citizen science, indigenous knowledge, and so on and so on. But there is a helpful point in this as well. There's reference to the ozone, and we know that the ozone layer challenge has been successfully addressed through a multilateral environmental treaty. So we need to gather the science, we need to pay attention to whose science, this needs to be inclusive, there is hope, but that's another reason why the planetary framing, I think, can be helpful. And I'll just note one other thing. If you look at this, of course, climate change is very foregrounded in people's thinking. But if you look at this, would you instantly pick climate change as being the most severe looking problem? And what's that nitrogen thing anyway? And why don't we have a treaty about that? So there's much that could be said there. A different framework, but one that's very common, is the idea of sustainable development. I co-edited a book with some colleagues, a Cambridge handbook on environmental justice and sustainable development, so keeping our justice framing in mind. You could think of sustainable development, and people often do, you can see I've got a little stool over there, as the stool in which economy, society, and environment form the base of the stool, and this, there are trade-offs that can be made between them, but these are separate pillars. I entirely reject that framing. It is a very dominant one, however. I think what's really important is for us to think about the idea of ecological floors and ecological ceilings, the planetary ceiling, the ecological floor. Healthy societies are dependent upon healthy and resilient ecological floors, and economy should always only ever serve society within the limits of planetary boundaries and with respect to the ecological floor. But dominant narratives are about balancing and trade-offs. I also put a donut in the corner for anybody who's familiar with Kate Raworth's framework. I won't say anything more about that. I think that's quite helpful. Some people find it useful. And I also have future generations at the bottom, because of course Sustainable Development Brundtland definition is premised on the idea of respect for future generations, and so that should and must also be important. And this is my last framework slide. I wasn't going to put this in here, but then I did, because we had some very interesting conversations in one of the panels about the challenges of valuation of non-economic loss in the climate context. And this is something I've thought about quite a bit in this book that I co-edited with a colleague, Meinhard Duell, who's sadly passed away too soon. Meinhard and I were determined to gather contributions that looked at the problem of climate loss and damage, but didn't look at it just from within the climate treaty. So we have a section of chapters that look at what has the climate regime done for loss and damage. And then the rest of the book, which is by far most of the book, is saying, and how are all these other legal regimes that are out there, whether it's different frames from public international law, transnational law, looking at domestic private international law complexities, justice frameworks. Somebody I think mentioned Kyle White earlier, and he's a contributor to the book in terms of an Indigenous justice approach to climate loss and damage, which points to the idea that, you know, if you're looking at timeframes and looking at solutions, it's not the same from an Indigenous justice perspective. And Carmen Gonzalez has a great contribution in this book as well, bringing a racial capitalism lens. So, for example, even if we're thinking about a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, is it enough that we leave the sacrifice zones of carbon capitalism unremediated, even on a local ecological justice scale? The fossil fuel industry has not cleaned up after itself, even in the local context. Is that okay? How do we grapple with that? So those are the frameworks. And now I want to turn to human rights and environment, and I could have called this environmental democracy or the environmental civic space. This, for me, is a great pathway forward, looking at and thinking through what framework drawn based on a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment could do for helping us with pathways forward. I found in particular the 2018 framework principles developed by John Knox when he was Special Rapporteur of Human Rights and the Environment to be particularly useful. And they start with this idea that states should ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in order to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And then as a second point, states should respect, protect, and fulfill human rights in order to ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And then as a third point, the importance of non-discrimination and ensuring equal and effective protection against discrimination. And I think those three pillars, which you could sort of link to substantive environmental outcomes, procedural human rights outcomes, and this non-discrimination, attention to vulnerability piece, is a really important way of thinking through this framework. And I have more to say about that. This is, so often the substantive aspect is divided into clean air, safe climate, clean water, or safe and sufficient water, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, non-toxic places, healthy and sustainably produced foods as another piece. The framework principles have a lot of different things in them. I think they provide a very rich elaboration of procedural, environmental, human rights that go beyond sort of the procedural, the three-pillar procedural environmental rights that sort of comes through international environmental law. And so we have this great fusing of human rights and environment, which gives us a lot to work with. Principle 4 focuses in on the importance of respecting and supporting human rights defenders. And that, I think, is another crucially important piece of the puzzle. So in some work that I did in collaboration with the UN Environment Program on developing materials on a human rights-based approach to the plastic value chain, we, put together this little image. The idea of these substantive protections are on the right, the procedural dimensions are on the left, and underneath are these cross-cutting guarantees of equity and non-discrimination, the importance of centering groups and individuals who are disproportionately affected by environmental harms. And that centering has to account for the fact that many people are disproportionately affected by environmental harms because they are were subject to, or continuing to be subject to ongoing discrimination and human rights violations. And so if we hope to realize substantive environmental gains, it's essential to support those in vulnerable groups, if that's the phrase one wants to use, to enable them to engage all the various dimensions of procedural environmental rights in order to realize the substantive ones. And so this is an ongoing process. It's not a one-off. We have to keep at it on all of these pieces. Now, I've noted intersectionality as a little sort of moment to think about here. If you look at the framework principles, from 2018, one of the principles hones in on sort of this idea of different vulnerable groups and tends to treat them sort of separately, but of course we want to think of them intersection. So women and girls, but children, those who are aged, those living in poverty, migrants, those who are disabled, I can keep going, racially marginalized groups, and so on and so on and so on. There are many on sort of the list of categories that are typically sort of included in thinking about the vulnerable groups aspect, which of course includes Indigenous peoples. They get their own separate principle in the framework principles, and that's largely to recognize rights of self-determination, which are distinct from some of the other framings. And so thinking intersectionally at that moment, I think, is really important. And of course, we now have, from 2022, a UN General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. Canada, I'm from Canada, voted in favor, while saying we don't really understand what this means, but we look forward to working with the international community to figure this out. So I think when I use this framework and draw on the 2018 framework principles, and I know the 2018 framework principles came out of a set of mapping reports that John Knox had done, looking at, I think there were 14 different mapping reports looking at many different sources of international law. His conclusion was that generally there is this consensus that these different principles exist and reflect existing state practice and what we see in the treaties, while acknowledging that not every state necessarily accepts all of those aspects. So this is good and hopeful. And I see it also as a Canadian. In 2007, when the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted through a UN General Assembly resolution, Canada voted against it. Now, it's very clearly endorsed. They're embedded. We now do much in terms of education, practice, application. It is night and day since 2007, and that's less than 20 years. And so, again, a hopeful piece is what might happen 20 years from 2022 with the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment if there's enough continued attention and activism and support. A little tribute to the work of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. In doing work in this area, I found some of their reports to be quite helpful. There was one on the importance of respect for human rights defenders, which says, in part, a cultural shift is required so that both states and businesses understand human rights defenders as essential allies in protecting people and planet rather than enemies. And I think that's hugely important. There's also a gender justice guide, and so on. continuing the momentum is, with excitement, the extension of thinking about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in relation to the ocean. So we have the Human Rights Council resolution from quite recently on the ocean and human rights through a human rights and environment lens. We have the endorsement by the International Court of Justice and the Climate Advisory Opinion of the existence of a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and that it's essential for the realization of all human rights. And then we have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights Climate Advisory Opinion, adding what is incredibly important dimensions, that one must see this right not just as an individual right, but that it also has collective dimensions, and that it's an autonomous right, so that nature is protected in and of itself, even if humans are not directly harmed. This is really important, links to ideas of rights of nature, but links it to recognition of a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And I think a key piece of this is rights of nature don't actualize themselves in a human-created justice system. You need humans to be able to go to court to protect rights of nature. And so this framing, I think, gives us a bit of a tool to work in that direction. So back to this. All of this is super optimistic, and this is a big part of what I teach and do and think about. But I have a little hesitation. So the hesitation comes in part from the work that I did on the plastics project, and the next slide talks about that a little bit. But as an example, here's my concern. The challenge is, if the idea is that Indigenous peoples and women, for example, and children and youth are marginalized groups that are disproportionately affected, but then also should be empowered so that they can take the lead in addressing these problems. Is there a risk, first, of overburdening those in those positions, putting the expectation on certain groups who have been struggling for reasons that have to do with other groups as well, violating their rights, sort of putting the burden on. So I'm not saying we reject those frameworks. I think it's crucially important. Everything I said before, I totally believe it is hugely important. But it's not enough. And it's not enough for a number of reasons. So I've talked some meetings about there is a bit of a victim savior narrative that sort of goes with this, in that the victim, those who are victimized are also those who should be empowered to save the world. There's a challenge sometimes of essentialism. So if I go back to that book on environmental justice and sustainable development, I made it we made a lot of effort to get all of our authors to take an intersectional approach. But many women authors in particular did not want to write about gender justice. For myself, I took a fabulous course on relational feminism and law in my second year of law school. It was the first thing that made any sense to me. It was fabulous. And then I proceeded to ignore anything to do with feminism and law for the next 15 years. There are a lot of reasons for that. It's we'll have the women's panel over here, or they'll have their conference over there, but it's not real. It's not the real thing. There's a lot that goes into that. So another piece of it, I think, and this is what I'm trying to address in the next set of materials, is a risk also that this framing doesn't help to conceptualize the role of environmentally focused men, and especially environmentally focused white men who don't fit into any of the marginalization categories. And there are a lot of fabulous people like that in this room who clearly have a big role to play. So how do we better conceptualize their role as allies? How do we bring everybody on board? What else needs to sort of happen? And so I'm just gonna skip this through. This was the plastic. I'll just say one thing about this. This, I guess, is the other troubling piece, right? Or why things were troubling. If we look at something like the plastics challenge, right, it's not a simple problem. There are many things that need to happen, and if we're expecting sort of rights holders to be activists at each stage of the linear take, make, waste plastic cycle, there's a lot of work to do to then make transformation into sort of circular regenerative economy structures. And so again, I totally am a believer in the human rights and environment intersectionality approach. But what I'm proposing in this towards an intersectional relational feminist approach to the human is something a little bit different. So I put as a subtitle that the aim here is a course correction of the bounded autonomous individual that is very dominant in legal thought. Okay. Yeah, okay, good. So I am going to then take you through this new, different framing. I will say I've been thinking about this for probably 10 years or so and have written the occasional article or chapter in different sort of spaces as I'm trying to sort of work this through, but there's a lot more work to be done. The first point is that anybody who's gone to law school in a common law jurisdiction knows that some time is spent contemplating who is the reasonable person. Okay. And what gender might they be, or what race might they be, or what anything else might they be. So we can think of the bounded autonomous individual in the same way. The tendency is to think of the individual human as being autonomous, independent in and of themselves. They have come into existence miraculously. They are, subject to individual tests at the university. We treat people like that, right? And then they are going to succeed out of their own brilliance. The reality is there is no such thing as a bounded autonomous individual. Anybody in existence who is doing well because they have been surrounded by nurturing relationships that have enabled them to realize their autonomy. That includes social relationships, but it also includes ecological relationships. And that is really important to acknowledge. And I didn't come up with this myself. This is themes that we see in much feminist work. I had the privilege of studying with Jennifer Dalhousie, who's published a brilliant book on relational autonomy. And she, in her course, shared a lot of her work with us at that time. Martha Feynman and Greer, the work of feminist materialists who think about corporeal citizenship, and also Angela Harris's work on ecological vulnerability and difference. So there's so much more, but then I put that together in my thinking with the work of Canadian Indigenous feminist scholars who've written a lot about the way in which they understand relationship as Indigenous women and what that might mean. And I know Sherry Pictou is one of my colleagues right now who holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous governance and gender. So that's an example. Her work is fantastic. So putting it all together, the conclusion would be that while all humans are differentially situated due to colonial and patriarchal histories and presence, all humans are also ecologically embedded and socially and ecologically relational individuals. So what do we do with that? What I've done is introduce what I'm jokingly calling, and maybe not so jokingly calling, Desiri, the differentially situated, ecologically embedded relational individual, as the challenge to the bounded autonomous individual. And the point would be that it's prevalent in legal thinking, but often unacknowledged. So the question is, how and where can we find it and challenge it and replace it with Desiri? Nadelsky asks, what patterns of relationships do we wish to nurture between peoples in the material world? What relationships do we have a responsibility to nurture, including temporal responsibilities? And how to think about the answer to that is going to depend on where you are, who you are, and lots of different pieces. But going back to my comment about in Mi'kmaq, we are all treaty people, the reciprocal relationships with the natural world, ancestors, and future generations that my Mi'kmaq colleagues would claim are also responsibilities that attach to me as somebody who lives in Mi'kmaq. For everyone, we are all relational. So I've found often that some of my students have had a lot of difficulty sort of grappling with this because they want to pretend their parents and siblings don't exist. But their parents and siblings do exist, and everybody lives in a community. And all of our communities, and in fact, as a consumer, we're very dependent on transnational consumption patterns and relationships, and that's an important piece as well. So we're all dependent on local ecosystems, on the biosphere, on social relationships, but we're all also differentially situated. So I call this project one, I used to call it reimagining, and I've shifted towards saying, actually, this is about truth-telling. This isn't about the feminists over there in the room over there who should be kind of, do their thing over there, but the main real law work goes on over here. Actually, the main real law work is not truthful. And the truthful part is that there is no such thing as a bounded autonomous individual, but there definitely are differentially situated, ecologically embedded relational individuals. So what does that mean? It means a lot for different areas of law. So I have different papers where I've been thinking about this in different areas of law, and I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. So if you think about the worker in the first paper that I think about this in relates to the Rana Plaza factory collapse, the response to that horrific disaster was very much to focus on what would be the protections that would be required to keep the worker alive so that they can keep doing their job, the cog in the wheel of capitalism. At the same time, though, as that factory disaster occurred, there were reportings about the environmental impacts of that factory and the factories in that area, and the impacts on the children of the workers. So children, news reports that were interviewing children who were saying, well, it's hard to concentrate at school because the air is so polluted and I get headaches and the water isn't clean. And at the same time, we saw, in a positive note, UNICEF and others working, drawing on the children's business principles to frame solutions that looked at the importance of safe and sustainable livelihoods for parents as a way of ensuring healthy children. That's relational. That's ecologically embedded, socially relational, with attention to difference. And so I think there's a lot that could happen there. The Special Rapporteur on Toxic Substances did a brilliant report on the principles on toxic substances for workers, which again adopts this kind of relational thinking, but also contemplates how is it that workers could become sort of environmental activists for their communities and their families. And so what would it mean to change labor laws to treat workers not just as being concerned about their own health, but as being concerned about the well-being of their communities and the well-being of communities that might be impacted by the products that they are producing. And so that would include whistleblower laws and various other things. Another piece is business law. So Lynn Stout has done some really great work that's been inspirational in that space. But how can we think differently? How can we think of corporate directors as ecologically embedded relational individuals and use the difference idea? The tendency in corporate law has been to say, let's have quotas or reporting on quotas for different, for women or for others. But is that enough? Maybe it's different kinds of educational experiences or something else that makes it more likely that people who think of themselves in a Desiree light are in those leadership positions so that they have the capacity to actually make and guide decisions in the right way. there's a lot of different things that could happen there. I've written and thought about the corporate form. The corporate entity also tends to be thought of as a bounded autonomous individual. You need to unveil it in order to have responsibility attached to the corporate enterprise. So I think we can also think of it in that way and link it to supply and value chain responsibility. And then finally, there's a huge piece of this work that attaches to international law. And for this, I would credit Karen Knopf, who wrote a brilliant paper in 1993 called Feminist Restatements on State Sovereignty, where she takes apart international law and state sovereignty through a relational lens. And this can lead us to ask questions like, does it make sense for us to treat the state only as a primary sole actor in international law? I use UNDRIP as an example again. It isn't that states woke up one morning and said, let's recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. And we could say the same with the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. It's coalitions of people working across states that lead to these initiatives, which are then brought to states to be recognized. But it's not states that create them. So how should that change how we understand their normative force? I think it should. I can say more about the territorially bounded state. This is another critique. Trump is all about borders. Trump is all about the bounded autonomous individual. That is how he understands state sovereignty. And we could spend a lot of time on that one, why that's wrong. It doesn't account for transboundary ecological relationships, obviously. Birds, plants, climate, everything does not respect borders. You can pretend they're not real, but there it is. And more. So I think I've probably gone now quite a long time.
I mean, it's your discussion time. It is 1:45, so I want to have some good discussion time. It probably.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm just gonna say I have written quite a bit about this, the international law piece. So if you are interested in that, I'm happy to share things. I think more generally, this is a work in progress. I've gotten to a certain point, but there's still a lot more work to be done. And so my encouragement, I guess, would be if this grabs your attention in any way, let's chat. What are the ways that we can actually make transformative change by confronting something that has been a problem in legal systems for a long time, and it probably just needs to be articulated in ways so that we can really overcome it. And thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Sara, for very thought-provoking and connecting the dots. So because talking about justice could take years, right? And you talked about various strands of justice and how do they connect together, and connecting it with also the theme of the conference. So thank you very much for that exciting presentation and also the invitation to engage with this work. Very much appreciated. So what we will do now is, the remaining 15 minutes or so, we will collect some questions. I will start with people in the room, and then we'll hopefully go online as well if there are questions online. So anyone in the room would like to ask any questions, any comments, any reflections to Sara? Please raise your hand. I know this has been very intense 2 days and long days, I would say, because we started at 9 and continuing yesterday also almost until 9. So we'll start with her. Yeah. Please identify yourself if you may and pose your question. Thank you.
Hi.
Very quiet.
All right. Okay. There we go. Hi, my name is Nina. I'm actually an alum of Macquarie University, and that's a really interesting talk. So thank you very much. I don't exactly know what my question is, but I think it's just a point of discussion in terms of intersectionality, especially with climate change and everything else going on in the world. I wanted to draw some parallels with obviously the wars that are going on and the environmental impacts on that, but that obviously there's so much deeper like human rights violations in that, which also then flows down to a lot of what I think my generation is recognizing in mental health.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of that aspect of intersection as well with mental health, the younger generation sort of coming into all of these crises.
Yeah, I think so. I have two kids who are university age, and I hear you deeply. And I think so. I mean, you know, if we had another hour, I would be happy to link sort of some of this thinking also to peace building, right? And the importance of that. The mental health challenges are real, and I mean, another thing we haven't talked about, right, is tech and AI and growing energy demands, but also addiction issues that we have with devices that didn't exist before, that now none of us can put down, and it draws us and keeps us in these places that also makes it really challenging for us to even feel ourselves to be ecologically embedded, let alone socially relational. And so there's a lot going on right now that is challenging. And so I think in some ways, what I want to say is, as much like I am a huge believer in the human rights and environment framework and the importance of attention to sort of vulnerability and challenges, but I also think it's so important, even as we want to support youth and others who want to take the lead, that we don't put the burden on youth and those in marginalized and vulnerable groups and those who are struggling. We don't put the burden on them to do the leading, because the leading, what needs to be done is that everybody needs to understand themselves as ecologically embedded, socially relational individuals with difference. And I will say, I attended this ecofeminist, non-law ecofeminist huge workshop in Berlin a couple of years ago. And the talk that I found the most like amazing was given by this guy from Sweden who had a project where they had identified the powerful men in the community and engaged them on going on ecofeminist water walks, where they would give them ecofeminist materials and then go and like look at uncovering sort of culverts. And I mean, one of the things that's going on right now is also like, you see, why is Trump in power? What's going on in the space, in the alternate space, you know, the mirror world to where we are now, right? How do we get them to understand and embrace relationality in all these facets? And I think that's super important work. But sorry, I'm talking a lot.
It's okay. That's why we got you here. We wanted to hear from you. Let me pick one question from Slido. I'll rephrase the question slightly. So the question is that what is the best way to explain all of this that you are talking about to a layman? I will change the layman to layperson. For those working outside of academia or legal sector who might need help understanding this topic, otherwise they feel intimidated. So how will you explain, let's say, to a 5-year-old child what you have been explaining to us? Say.
So for the 5-year-old child, they probably have less trouble with the social relationality because they probably see themselves very much as in relationship with their parents. And if they have an opportunity to be playing outside a lot, they may have opportunities also to be building that ecological relationality. So I think in some ways the explanation is action, right? And performance is going and doing, while being able to acknowledge privilege and difference and responsibility that attaches in that way. So it is tricky to explain it simply. I'm not quite there yet, but I'd appreciate any tip.
So then we would need to invite you back by the time you are able to simplify things. Okay, let me go back to the room. So I will pick a question from anyone in the room before I go online again. So is there anyone else who would like to? Oh,
Hi, so very insightful session actually. My question is not related to the theory or part that you dealt with, but what inspired you to go into feminist environmental justice area and the government? Want to know that.
So, I mean, I noted that, you know, I was in law school, had this incredible opportunity to study with this amazing woman who wrote these wonderful things that really resonated with me. And then I ignored it for 15 years. And then what happened was the PhD work that I'd done was on questions of whether Canada could be said to have a responsibility to regulate Canadian-based mining companies operating internationally for environmental and human rights harms. And that then led me to thinking about Indigenous rights more broadly. In Canada, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came out with lots of recommendations. And this was followed by the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's and Girls Inquiry, which includes within it explicit recommendations for extractive industries to address the gender violence. And for me and a colleague who had been working on sort of mining justice issues, I think we suddenly went, hang on a second, why are we not talking about gender? Like, this is ridiculous. Why is this so difficult for us, right? And so then from there, working with my colleague Penelope Simons, we hosted a workshop on extractive industries and gender, and brought in quite a group to work on that. And then from there, it became, okay, and gender and climate justice and everything else. And it becomes just an essential piece, right? And so the question that, you know, that you asked the question and that I had that experience, I think is part of the challenge. It's like, hang on a second, I even had this incredible education, and yet I then put it on a shelf for 15 years. Like, what's that about? I try to nudge my students in this direction too, but still it's difficult. People don't, there's a reluctance, right?
All right. So, any other questions? I know it's late in the evening, so but any other questions? A final call. Otherwise, going to wrap it up. I will pick one question. I see Matthew. Okay, brave Matthew. So we'll take one question from Matthew, and there's one tiny question from Slido. So we'll take it might be this, and then you can reflect.
It might be the same question. So I guess my question was about how do the intersectionalities relate to non-human beings, which I know within Southeast Asia, as we're working on the Declaration on the Right to a Safe, Clean, Healthy and Sustainable Environment, it was very clear from the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights that rights of nature, rights of non-human beings was simply not something that ASEAN was willing to discuss. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how that perspective, you know, can go forward.
So the first thing would be, it's easier if you are located in an area which, like I am, is governed by the Peace and Friendship Treaties. And so I refer to my colleague Sherry Picto. There's a brilliant paper that she and a group of settler and Indigenous Mi'kmaq, led by Albert Marshall, they put together principles on biodiversity, and published it in a journal. And the first author is Ms. Nogmad, which means all my relations in Mi'kmaq, and essentially is the land. So they gave first authorship to nature. And the entire work is sort of informed by that. So if you are in an area where Indigenous cultures clearly recognize these relational responsibilities, then it's much easier, I think, to put nature, you know, to take that frame. And it's not just Indigenous cultures. I think the added piece, though, is coming through the human rights and environment lens. If you look at the sort of substantive protections and you understand that humans cannot thrive unless they are, you know, unless they are supported by healthy and resilient ecosystems and biodiversity within planetary boundaries, then that relationship is also clear. We might like to pretend that it doesn't matter, but the truth is that it does. And so that's more difficult to convey, but hopefully we can get there.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I did not ask any question at the conference, right? So maybe this is my chance, right? This is my chance to ask. Because I did raise hands and somehow I let it go. So I am curious, how does political economy comes into picture in relation to the theories of justice that you have been articulating, right? Because one could make a case that we should move towards this idea not of justice, right? But if we look at the ground reality globally, not just in developing Western traditions, but in developing countries, Asian traditions, global South, the dominant paradigm and the political economy is contrary to what we are trying to achieve during these 2 days here, right? So how do we convince those actors and the ideology they are trying to weave in into our economies to do the course correction? I don't know if you have reflections. Very simple question.
But I think in a sense, this is what the project is about, right?
Yeah.
Because the point really is that the bounded autonomous individual lurks unacknowledged.
Yeah.
And so the project is, anytime you're working with a legal doctrine, think about it, right? What is it? And this is a very silly sort of example, but you probably know, I don't like the word, or I have trouble with the word extraterritorial.
Yeah.
When it comes to human rights obligations. Why is that? Because it puts a bright line boundary between one state and another. What it does is it performs, it actually creates, it enables the bounded autonomous individual version of the state. But that's not real. So when a state is resisting, for example, mandatory human rights due diligence legislation that then might infringe its sovereignty, it would put up the extraterritorial boundary and say, don't come in, right? But if you think relationally, you kind of want to think about, well, what is the nature of the relationship to which responsibility should attach? But I think the point generally is active contemplation and critique and destruction of the bounded autonomous individual in whatever manifestation, whether it's as the worker, as the director, as the business entity, as a state, it's all over the place. And it informs legal doctrine, and we need to get rid of it.
All right, so I think that's a good note to end this annual lecture of the Center, Environmental Law Research Center, but as well as this will also conclude the conference. So may I request all of you to have a round of applause for Sara Seck. And she traveled all the way from Canada, and so it's not. I mean, coming to Australia is challenging anyway. But coming all the way from Canada also makes it more complex. But thank you very much for finding time and engaging with the conference, as well as delivering very thought-provoking lecture. We very much appreciate that. So that is the wrap for this conference for today's. Catherine, do I say Catherine? Yeah. Catherine did. Yeah, she is there. Yeah. So Catherine did the vote of thanks, but I mean, I also like to thank each one of you, because of course we working behind the scene could create a program, speakers can come in, but if there are no participants and they're not engaging, they're not asking questions, they go home, or they're in the room, they're not engaging, they're looking at their mobile phones, we could not have done this conference without each one of you, right? So I want to thank each one of you for engaging and participating in this. And I would like to ask our volunteers to stand up, please. Tom here. And where is Tom? Where has Tom gone?
You've all seen him.
Okay, but we have seen Tom, right? So a round of applause. Thank you, everyone. keep supporting the Center for Environmental Law, keep engaging with us, and watch out for more information. And of course, as I mentioned, there will be some publication pathways and plans. We'll share more information on that. Tom is here. It's very difficult to escape, Tom. So, we got you. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.